Finding a therapist who you like and get along with and who actually has the tools to help you with whatever's going on in your life is a pretty daunting task. It can feel a little bit like going out into the woods and looking for a unicorn. You might wonder if the thing you're trying to find even exists anywhere out there at all, this mythological being. And even if they do exist, you might have no clue where they might be hiding. Maybe you read a lot of therapist bios or websites to try to find someone who sounds like a fit. And I'm generally of the opinion that the information that people put on those websites and bios is actually not very useful in figuring out if they're a good fit for you or not. Potentially controversial statement coming, but I don't really think our education matters that much. Like, truly, I don't. This work is not something you can learn how to do well by studying it academically. It just isn't. And I don't think that surface level personal information is all that critical either. Many of the clients that I've had long term, like multiple year beneficial working relationships with, have very little in common with me on the surface, like demographics, hobbies, interests. I'm a cat person, but I can still be your therapist if you're a dog person. It really doesn't matter. I do think there are questions that everyone who is in therapy or considering being in therapy should ask their therapist or potential therapist. And if you're wondering, am I even allowed to ask my therapist questions? You should be. You absolutely should be. And if you're not, that's an immediate red flag. If your therapist is not willing to share the most basic of information with you about who they are and how they plan to help you, it means one of two things. They either have a really weird view of therapy and they essentially think that it's kind of like a magic trick where if they tell you what they're going to do, it won't work somehow. Or more likely, they don't really have answers to these questions. And their plan with you was basically to show up, be present, hold space, and just sort of wing it and hope that things work out. My opinion is that you deserve better than that. And asking these questions will help you get what you need. So for each of these questions, I'm going to share what I would consider to be a green flag answer, a yellow flag answer, and a red flag answer. Massive disclaimer here. Therapy is a very individualized and personal process. What one person wants from a therapist is not the same as what the next person wants. And so these are the answers I would be looking for in my therapist. I'm not you. And so if my answers, if I say this would be a red flag answer and you're like, oh crap, my therapist has said that, and you love your therapist and your therapist is helping you, ignore me. It doesn't matter because I am not trying to mess with a therapeutic relationship that's working. But if you're not, I do think the way they answer these questions could tell you a lot about whether you should continue to work with them or whether you might want to consider seeing somebody else. And as far as timing, as in like when to ask these questions, ideally at the end of the first session. Now, if you're already working with a therapist, that doesn't work, but a therapist who has known you for an hour is not going to have perfect answers to every single question you ask them, but they should have a rough draft. Legit, they should have an idea. If they have no clue how to answer any of these questions after an hour of you probably pouring out your heart and soul to them, that is a major red flag. If you're already in therapy and established with a provider, you should be able to ask these questions at any time. And if your therapist does something weird, like refuses to answer or gets really evasive and is like, what does that mean to you? Or gets offended at a question like this, universal red flag. I would avoid that provider. The first question all therapy clients should ask their therapist is something along the lines of, what do you think is wrong with me? You don't have to say it quite like that, but something like that. I would consider a green flag answer to this question to be an answer that makes sense to you. And there's a lot of ways that could look. If your therapist is a psychologist like me, they're probably going to give you a diagnosis at the end of the first session. And they should be able to explain that diagnosis. They should be able to tell you what it means, what the symptoms are, why they think you have this specific thing. And if they can accurately articulate the symptoms of that diagnosis and you listen to them and you're like, that really does sound very much like me, I would say this is a green flag answer. A green flag answer does not have to be a diagnosis, though. It can be more of a general conceptualization. So maybe instead of saying you have generalized anxiety disorder, maybe they say, long sentence incoming, I think you have a passive communication style and avoidant tendencies, which causes your needs to go unmet in interpersonal relationships, causing you to build up resentment that eventually sabotages your relationships and reinforces your belief that you're unlovable. And that does indeed sound like a pattern you think you have. That's a green flag answer. And I was pretty proud of that, what I just did there. A yellow flag answer, I would say, is more of just a curious answer. You know, if they say something along the lines of, I have a couple ideas here and there, but like really, I need more time to get to know you. I need to understand a little bit more about you. I have more questions for you. Basically, an answer that indicates curiosity and a desire to learn more, that's reasonable after an hour. Again, if you've been honest and vulnerable in that first session, they should at least know something. They should at least have a rough idea. But it's really not reasonable to think that a person's going to have you all figured out after an hour. The second session is usually when you start really getting down to doing some actual work. The first session is typically more of like an interview and getting to know one another. So you should be able to at least identify that some work will begin soon and that the work will make sense to you. A red flag answer would be a therapist who just straight up refuses to answer, like they won't tell you, or they give you an answer that feels very wrong to you. So if your therapist says something like, I think your struggles with executive functioning stem from unresolved childhood trauma, and you did not mention any childhood trauma in the diagnostic interview, that's a red flag because it suggests that your therapist has basically just invented their own narrative about you. They probably use sort of a one-size-fits-all approach to therapy, which is a real thing. They just think everyone essentially has the same problem. I used to work with a guy who diagnosed something like 90% of his clients with bipolar disorder. And the statistics of that are just incredibly unlikely. I think he actually had bipolar disorder, so we saw it in everybody. That is a thing that happens sometimes. I've also heard therapists say things like, the diagnosis is just for the insurance company and it doesn't really matter. Our work will be the same regardless of what label we put on it, which is a massive red flag because the work should not be the same for everybody. Again, therapy is an individualized process. It should not be a one-size-fits-all approach. If your therapist just does the same thing no matter who they're sitting with, major red flag. The second question all therapy clients should ask their therapist is, how can you help me get better? A green flag answer would connect to their perception of what you are struggling with. So this is sort of a follow-up from the first question, right? And it should involve clear action steps from both the therapist and you in and out of session. So if I say something like, based on your phobic avoidance of social situations, I would like for us to do hierarchical exposure therapy for social anxiety, which will involve me training you on cognitive and behavioral techniques for reducing anxiety, and you between sessions entering social situations which gradually increase in difficulty while practicing the techniques I teach you to reduce anxiety and result in you feeling more comfortable in social situations. That's a pretty darn good answer. A yellow flag answer might just be a little bit more broad or generic. So if your therapist says, I would be doing cognitive behavioral therapy for depression with you, or we're going to do EMDR for your PTSD, those are reasonable answers. They are not super specific or individualized, but they make sense. There is nothing wrong with them. A red flag answer would be one with either no real plan or a plan that doesn't make sense. So if a therapist says something like, the plan is for you to just keep showing up and talking and we'll figure it out. That's not a plan. Like that's literally the bare minimum. That's literally your therapist saying, I will continue to exist and have an office. That's what I call lazy therapy. And it shows that your therapist has zero investment in you and no real understanding of you as a person. A plan that doesn't make sense is a little harder to detect because you, as a therapy client, may not know like what treatments are for what conditions. You can easily look this up though. APA Division 12 is a good source here. It basically gives you a breakdown of like this treatment is for this. I used to work with someone who just always did EMDR, no matter what, which was great for some clients and terrible for some. If you had PTSD, she did EMDR, which makes sense. If you had anxiety, she did EMDR, which maybe makes sense. If you had schizophrenia, she did EMDR, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense, unless the person with schizophrenia also had PTSD, which many do, but not all. Again, one-size-fits-all approaches in therapy, not a great idea. The third question all therapy clients should ask their therapist is, what is your experience treating people like me? This one's a little tricky because people like me can mean a lot of different things here. This could mean, what is your experience treating someone with anorexia? It could mean, what is your experience working with Black people with PTSD? It could mean, have you ever worked with a depressed Christian before? Like, there's a lot of different overlapping Venn diagrams that make up who you are and what's specific about you. And while there's nobody in the world quite like you, it is reasonable to ask your therapist if they have ever helped someone who is at least somewhat like you. Because that's something I would want to know about my therapist. Like, am I the unicorn here? Have you never met a single person like me before? And you're just going to make this up as we go. A green flag answer to this question would involve an appropriate, non-HIPAA violating explanation of who they have helped who is somewhat like you. Obviously, they can't break confidentiality of past or current clients, so it's not going to be like super detailed. But if I was answering the question about anorexia, I might say for 18 months, I was a core staff member of an intensive outpatient program for anorexia in Minneapolis. If I was answering the question about a Black client with PTSD, I might say that, excuse me, my predoctoral internship was at Ramsey County Mental Health Center, which, at least when I worked there, had a caseload that was about 50 to 75% Black, and I am a level 1 sensory motor trained psychotherapist with a strong competence in treating PTSD. For the depressed Christian client, I might say I have worked with many individuals of the Christian faith who suffered from depression, and I am comfortable integrating elements of your Christian beliefs and of your faith into our work together. And hopefully, what all of those answers would communicate to you is, yeah, I have helped people like you before, and I would really enjoy the opportunity to do it again. I like working with people like you, and I have a rough sense of what might work. A yellow flag answer here, I would say, would be a therapist who acknowledges their inexperience but handles it appropriately. So if someone asks me, have I worked with someone who struggles with hoarding? I might say, I have never worked with someone primarily on hoarding, at least to my knowledge, and I don't have a lot of direct experience in that area. I do know that we consider hoarding to be an anxiety disorder, and I'm comfortable treating anxiety in general. So, what I would hope is some of the skills I already have will carry over, but I will also be seeking out supervision, listening to podcasts, and reading books to broaden my knowledge on this subject because I'm not an expert. And if you ever feel like I'm not meeting your needs, please let me know, and I will help you find an appropriate referral who can. A red flag answer, as usual here, like would be one that's evasive or maybe even offensive. There's this thing therapists do sometimes, and the only groups of people I've seen do this are therapists and politicians, where they not only refuse to answer the question, they act like you're ridiculous for asking it. So if they say something like, why is it important to you to know if I've treated people like you before? First of all, I think that's pretty obvious. Like, what a dumb question, hypothetical therapist in my head. I want to know if you have the tools to help me. And if you can't figure out that's what I'm needing from you here, I don't really have a lot of faith in your ability to read me accurately. Second of all, answer the question, yes or no. It's not that complicated of a question. So those are the questions I think all potential or current therapy clients should be asking of their therapists. And hopefully that breakdown gives you a sense of what answers I would look for anyway. Again, I'm just going to repeat my disclaimer here. If your therapist sounds a lot like the red flag therapist I described, but you like working with them and they're helping you, please ignore everything I just said because you're a different person than me and you want different things out of therapy than me. But hopefully these questions are helpful to guide you for the process of finding a therapist and making sure that they're a good therapist because I know how hard that is to do. As always, I hope this helped. If it did, I hope you'll consider subscribing, liking, commenting. I'm going to continue making content like this as long as it benefits people, and I'll see you next time. Take care.